There's a hidden secret about growing up that affects many of us. Children who were unintentionally emotionally neglected by their parents often grow up with a deep-rooted sense of apology, as if their very existence is an interruption. At a party, they unconsciously stick to the corners, holding a drink and becoming part of the wallpaper, expertly playing the role of the quiet observer. They carry this caution into every intimate relationship, constantly testing their partner's limits, worried that their own needs will become a burden. They might achieve enviable success and stand in the spotlight, yet feel a frantic panic inside. They feel like it's all a fluke, with a voice in the back of their mind saying, "I don't deserve this. I'll probably be forgotten after the next mistake." This isn't because they aren't talented or valuable. It's because their sense of self was built in a silent echo chamber, like shouting into an empty canyon and never hearing a response. Psychology calls this phenomenon learned invisibility. It's an emotional survival strategy developed over time. Imagine a child's signals, whether crying, laughing, or a look that says, "Please see me," are repeatedly met with a vacuum of non-response from their parents. To protect itself, the child's brain begins to rewire. It learns a cruel survival rule. Expectation leads to pain and needs equal trouble. And so, the child who once reached out with open arms eventually learns to quietly pull them back. They begin to convince themselves that their desires for warmth, for validation, for a simple hug, are childish and inappropriate. Have you ever been at a family barbecue and seen a child like that? He's not chasing the other kids on the lawn. He's just sitting quietly on the porch swing, observing everything with a calmness that seems beyond his years. He's not without desire. He's just learned to bury it deep down, because he understands that if you don't expect anything, you can't be disappointed. On the surface, there's no dramatic conflict, no parents shouting at each other, not even a tense atmosphere. But beneath that unusual maturity and quietness, the child's inner world is undergoing a profound reshaping. Because for a growing person, being ignored isn't just about something being absent. It's more like a crack being silently chiseled into the very foundation of their self-worth. And here is a heartbreaking truth. Childhood emotional neglect, whether intentional or not, rarely shows up in sharp, dramatic ways. It's often not about what parents did, but what they didn't do. It's hidden in the excited stories that went unheard, when you ran to your mom with a crayon drawing, but she was buried in her phone. It dissolves in the lukewarm glances, when you played a tree in the school play and desperately searched the crowd for your dad's face, only to find his seat was empty. It vanishes in the hastily celebrated birthdays, with a gift bought in a hurry, one that wasn't what you really wanted. It's the moments missed because of a parent's work stress, life fatigue, or simple distraction. The moments they were too busy to notice, or never even realized, you were waiting to be seen. However, the psychological imprint left by this absence of love is far deeper than we can imagine. It shapes how a person sees themselves, how they interact with the world, and even decades later, how they give and receive love. We often have an overly optimistic view of children's resilience, thinking they're like superheroes who can bounce back from any harm. And yes, children adapt, but there is a huge gap between adapting and truly healing. When children learn to survive in an emotional vacuum, they often adapt by suppressing their true selves, hiding their real needs, and convincing themselves, "I'm just not that important." This survival kit gets them through a vulnerable childhood, but in adulthood, it becomes an invisible cage, often in ways they themselves don't recognize. From a developmental psychology perspective, being seen and responded to isn't just a nice feeling. It's essential to the construction of a child's inner world. The renowned attachment theory tells us that when a child's needs are consistently and reliably seen and met by a caregiver, they form a secure attachment to the world. This initial sense of safety becomes the foundation for all future exploration and trust. But if a child's calls are met with prolonged silence or unpredictable responses, they don't just feel a momentary sadness. They internalize a dangerous logic. My needs aren't worth meeting, so maybe I'm not worthy of love. This is not an exaggeration. Neuroscience has confirmed that when a child's attempts to connect with the outside world are repeatedly frustrated, their brain interprets this rejection as a threat to their survival. Levels of the stress hormone cortisol remain elevated. Over time, this can reshape their neural circuits, making high alert and anxiety their default response. Their emotional regulation system becomes incredibly fragile. Yet on the outside, they might just seem like an easy child, one who doesn't cause any trouble. When a child suffers clear abuse, the harm is visible. But when a child is neglected, the harm is diffuse and invisible, but just as real. He might stop asking questions early on because he's learned to expect no answers. He might stop sharing his joys because he knows no one will celebrate with him. Day by day, emotionally, he slowly begins to disappear. Unlike physical trauma, the wounds of emotional neglect are hidden beneath the skin, buried deep in the psyche. These scars often don't surface until adulthood, when the once neglected child tries to build an intimate relationship or achieve a career breakthrough. For example, many adults who grew up in neglectful environments struggle with chronic low self-esteem. They're afraid to speak up in meetings because a voice inside tells them, "Nobody wants to hear your ideas." They might have such an extreme fear of rejection that they choose loneliness over the risk of getting close to anyone. Or they might go to the other extreme, becoming a people pleaser at all costs, because deep down, they are still desperately trying to win the look of approval they never got as a child. Imagine a 7-year-old boy running home from school, clutching what he thinks is the best drawing he's ever made. He wants to show his parents, but they are focused on their phone screens. At dinner, he tries again, but the conversation revolves around work and bills. Finally, he quietly slips the drawing into a folder in his backpack and never mentions it again. Now imagine this scene not happening once, but hundreds or even thousands of times throughout a childhood. That child will eventually learn that his excitement, his pride, and even his small sorrows are things he must process all by himself. Years later, when this child is an adult, he might find it difficult to feel genuine joy in his own accomplishments. He will instinctively downplay them, as if they don't really matter. The child who was ignored eventually becomes an adult who ignores himself. Scientific research backs this up. A long-term study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry found that individuals who experienced emotional neglect in childhood had a significantly higher risk of developing depression and anxiety disorders in adulthood, and they demonstrated more insecurity in their intimate relationships. In other words, even when surrounded by friends and partners, they often feel a deep sense of loneliness that can never be filled. Most parents who neglect their children don't do it on purpose. This neglect is often a byproduct of their own stress, unresolved childhood trauma, mental health issues, or a simple lack of awareness of a child's emotional needs. A single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet may be completely drained of all emotional energy. A father suffering from depression may be incapable of noticing the fleeting look of disappointment in his child's eyes. In our time, the omnipresent digital devices, the endless notifications and information streams are also silently eroding focused, quality interaction within families. But motive doesn't change the outcome. For a child, the feeling of being skipped over is the same, regardless of the reason. This is why understanding the inner world of the neglected child is so important. Because seeing the problem is the first step toward healing and the beginning of breaking the cycle. Children of neglect often develop what seem like positive survival strategies. Some become exceptionally independent, learning to take care of everything themselves from a very young age. Others become straight-A students, trying to earn the attention they crave through perfect performance. And some become the peacemakers, highly sensitive to the emotions of others, avoiding conflict at all costs just to maintain a fragile sense of connection. But beneath this armor is often an exhausted heart. The independent child may grow up to find it difficult to truly trust or depend on others. The A student may become a perfectionist who can't tolerate any flaws, living in a state of constant self-criticism. And the peacemaker may become a people pleaser with no boundaries, giving until they have nothing left. Of all the adaptations, the most heartbreaking is perhaps the child who gives up trying altogether. The child who concludes, "If no one cares, why should I even bother?" This learned helplessness can follow them into adulthood, leaving them with a lack of passion, motivation, and hope. Neglected children rarely talk about their experience because how do you describe a harm that was an absence? There are no dramatic stories, no specific events to point to, not even a physical scar to show. There is only silence, the silence of countless moments that should have been, but weren't. And that very silence becomes a wall that prevents them from seeking help. In therapy, many clients with a history of neglect often start by saying, "My childhood wasn't a big deal, my parents were good people." They habitually minimize their own feelings because they were never taught that their invisible needs were just as important. But the absence of a necessity is, in itself, a profound form of trauma. It's like growing up in a room with no sunlight. You survived, but that doesn't mean you ever experienced true warmth. The long-term effects of this are real and well-documented. Research from Harvard University's Center on the Developing Child shows that consistent, positive interaction with parents builds and reinforces neural pathways related to resilience. Chronic neglect, on the other hand, weakens them. In short, being seen isn't an emotional luxury. It's a biological necessity for healthy brain development. This isn't to say that every neglected child is destined for a bleak life. On the contrary, many people who deeply understand the pain of being unseen grow into some of the most empathetic and insightful adults. But it does mean their journey is often harder. They have to spend enormous mental energy to question and rebuild the belief systems that were quietly installed in them before they were old enough to judge. So, where does healing begin? It doesn't start with a grand goal of becoming confident and powerful overnight. It starts with the simplest and yet hardest action: acknowledgement. Acknowledging that your childhood experiences had a profound impact on you. Acknowledging that your unmet needs were real and valid. Acknowledging that the pain you feel deep inside is worthy of being seen. For the child who grew up with neglect, the first step to healing is learning to give yourself the recognition you never received. This might sound abstract, but it can be very concrete in practice. It can be pausing after you finish a small task and telling yourself, "You did a good job." It can be allowing yourself to cry when you feel sad instead of habitually suppressing it. It can be bravely speaking an idea you have, even if it's just by writing it in a journal. Because the truth is, the longing to be seen doesn't disappear as we get older. We just bury it deeper. The journey of healing is about bringing that buried longing back into the light. Think about how this pattern shows up in relationships. The neglected child often grows up to be the most loyal listener, able to pick up on a friend's slightest mood shift, yet finds it almost impossible to talk about their own troubles. They are the first to show up when someone else is in need, but they rarely ask for help themselves. To outsiders, they might seem like a model of selflessness, but deep down, they're often haunted by an unspoken question. Why does it feel like I'm always less important than everyone else? This isn't selfishness. It's a longing for balance, a desire for a relationship to be a two-way street, not just a one-way street of giving. In romantic relationships, the impact of this childhood imprint can be even more complex. Some adults who were neglected as children will chase after any glimmer of warmth with the intensity of a moth to a flame, clinging tightly to anyone who shows them kindness as if it's a lifeline. Others will go to the opposite extreme, subconsciously keeping their partners at an emotional distance, because for them, intimacy represents a potential and unpredictable risk. These two seemingly opposite reactions actually stem from the same core fear, the fear that the neglect they once experienced will happen again, that their needs will ultimately go unmet. And yet, there is a beautiful paradox here. Those who were once neglected can often grow up to be some of the most empathetic and compassionate adults you will ever meet. Because they know the sting of being invisible, they are better able to feel the pain of others. Developmental psychology supports this. Neglected children often develop a powerful ability to read nonverbal cues. They were forced to learn how to observe subtle facial expressions, shifts in tone of voice, and body language because their survival once depended on this ability to read the room. They had to know exactly when it was safe to express themselves and when silence was the only option. This hypersensitivity, forged in adversity, can become an extraordinary gift in adulthood, turning them into excellent healers, artists, and friends. But this gift comes at a heavy price. They may get into the habit of shining the world's spotlight on everyone else, while leaving themselves in the dark. Behind this, there's another layer we rarely talk about. When a child's emotions and thoughts aren't sufficiently mirrored and validated by important people in their life, their sense of identity can become blurry and unstable. It's as if they've been living in front of a funhouse mirror, unable to see a clear reflection of who they really are. As a result, in adulthood, they may unconsciously seek excessive validation from the outside world. This isn't because they're shallow or vain. It's because, deep inside, they never had a solid, loving echo from others to help them confirm, yes, that is who you are and that is good. Our sense of self becomes clear in the reflection of our relationships. Without that clear reflection, the self feels fragile, as if it could dissolve at any moment. But it is on this seemingly barren ground that human resilience reveals its most moving power. Even if a child grows up through long years of neglect, a core desire for connection remains deep inside them, an almost instinctual, quiet hope of being seen. This is why so many people who were neglected as children embark on journeys of self-discovery as adults. They read psychology books. They immerse themselves in art. They try in any way they can to understand the mystery inside themselves. They refuse to let their entire lives be defined by the great silence of their childhood. They want to find their own voice. And that desire is the ultimate proof of their vitality. Healing is entirely possible. Research on neuroplasticity tells us that the brain isn't a fixed stone. It is constantly reshaping itself based on new experiences throughout our lives. This means that even if our childhood experiences carve deep grooves into our nervous system, we can still create new, healthier patterns through our efforts in adulthood. Every time you gather the courage to express a need and receive a positive response, your brain is recording a new experience. Expression is safe. Every time you set a healthy boundary and it is respected by others, your nervous system is learning a new kind of trust. Every moment of healing is rewriting the script deep inside you. The process of healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's just being able to finally say to a friend, "I'm not feeling great right now. I just need you to listen." Sometimes, it's allowing yourself to admit you're hurt instead of reflexively laughing it off. And sometimes, it's simply whispering to yourself when you're alone. Your feelings matter, even if no one told you that before. These seemingly small moments are actually a revolution inside you, because they are fighting back against years of conditioned silence. Of course, none of this is easy. Adults who grew up with neglect often have the deepest fear of rejection. So, expressing their true feelings feels terrifying. Setting healthy boundaries fills them with guilt. Asking for help makes them feel weak. But the courage to say, "I'm scared, but I'm going to do it anyway," is the very force that rebuilds self-worth. It's also important to understand this. Parents who neglect their children are not necessarily bad parents. Very often, they were neglected children themselves, unconsciously repeating the patterns they knew from their own childhoods. Sometimes, they were so trapped by the pressures of life, so lost in their own pain, that they had nothing left to give. This doesn't excuse the harm they caused, but it reminds us that the trauma of neglect is often a chain passed down through generations. When an adult begins to heal their own wounds of neglect, they are not just saving themselves. They are breaking a chain that may have spanned generations. Think of it this way. Every once neglected child who learns to listen to their own inner voice becomes a parent who knows how to better listen to the next generation. Every once neglected child who learns to value their own needs becomes a friend or partner who can teach others, "Your needs matter too." The ripples of your healing spread outward from your own heart. And this brings us to a final, crucial truth. A neglected child often feels like their life is a walk through the snow that leaves no footprints. But the reality is, their story holds immense power. Their journey from being invisible to fighting to be seen is the highest tribute to human resilience. By sharing their true experiences, they let others who are still struggling in silence know, you are not alone. By bravely healing themselves, they light a path of hope for those who come after them. So, if you were that child, if you have ever felt a bone-deep loneliness in a crowded room, if you have ever felt your emotions were an unnecessary burden, if you have ever doubted the meaning of your own existence, please let me tell you now, what you went through matters. How you feel now matters. You matter. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning to give yourself the visibility and compassion you have always deserved. It's about learning to see yourself not through the scratched and distorted lens of neglect, but through a lens that is clear and warm. It's about finally understanding that while the experience of being neglected has profoundly shaped you, it will never define you.